All right, welcome everybody to the final talk of our public seminar series here at Genome Sciences. I'm thrilled to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Sam Wasser. He's joining us from across the street where he's a professor in the Department of Biology and the director of their Center for Conservation Biology. Originally, Dr. Wasser received his undergraduate degree in zoology from Michigan State and his master's in zoology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He received his PhD in animal behavior here at the University of Washington. And since then, Dr. Wasser has won numerous awards, including Career Development Awards from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Smithsonian Institution, and he holds an endowed chair of conservation biology awarded by the University of Washington Board of Regents here. He's renowned worldwide as a pioneer of non-invasive wildlife monitoring methods and works with a number of conservation programs around the world and in collaboration with state, federal, and international organizations. The New York Times has dubbed him the Sherlock Holmes of the wildlife trade. And I know we'll hear more about his escapades on that here in his talk titled Genetic Approaches to Combat Transnational Environmental Crimes. So please join me in giving Dr. Wasser a warm welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was the director of the Center for Conservation Biology, but a couple of years ago, we actually formed a new center here called the Center for Environmental Forensic Science. I should update my webpage. So, I'm going to talk a lot about the work that we're doing right now at the center. And it's been an amazing journey because when we started it, I was trying to get senior scientists from the University of Washington to join that had expertise in a variety of different areas and really work together with law enforcement agencies, national, international, and NGOs to try to really deal with the problem of transnational organized crime, dealing with environmental issues. And to my surprise, almost instantly, we had 40 faculty members from most departments in the university. And it's been really an exciting time for me. And so I hope to talk a little bit about that today. I also changed my talk title a little bit, but so I'm really going to talk about the importance of this collaborative program for dealing with transnational organized crime and especially focusing on environmental crimes. The World Bank estimates that damage from transnational environmental crimes exceeds $1 trillion annually. So it's really a big issue, and the profits of these criminal organizations is about $200 billion each year. A lot of people don't appreciate the impact that this is having on climate, on biodiversity, on national security, economic security. We know from the impact of COVID, which was because of overregulation or just overuse of wildlife products, and that damage is pretty apparent to all of us. Well, sorry, I just really jumped forward here. Hang on a second. I'm just getting, okay. So our center is, as I mentioned, it's a novel collaboration of diverse scientists, state, national, and international law enforcement agencies, and non-government organizations that are all working together to disrupt and dismantle transnational environmental crimes. And the importance of this is that all of these different groups have different expertise, and scientists are bringing the science to bear, and law enforcement often doesn't appreciate what it can contribute to their work. And we have worked very hard to show them that. Similarly, non-government organizations, many of these organizations are working for decades in these countries, and they've built up strong trust with people that know the underpinnings of or what is going on in these countries and really are able to get to the bottom of things. So by combining all of this expertise, we've really created quite an interesting program that has been remarkably effective in bringing down some of the biggest transnational criminals actually operating in Africa on environmental crimes. This is the problem. These transnational criminal organizations are concealing huge amounts of contraband in maritime shipping trade. And essentially, they're concealing this in a burgeoning legal trade. And to just put this into perspective, there's 2.7 million containers, shipping containers, moving around the world every single day. And that gives law enforcement 17 seconds to look at the paperwork. They have about, if you look at how many containers get inspected, even in the most sophisticated countries like the US, less than 2%. So if you're a transnational criminal, all you got to do is to move large volumes of contraband is get it into a container, pay off whoever you need at the port to get it into transit, and you pretty much got it made. You know, they may catch one of your shipments, but you'll probably have 20 others get through. And what our work has shown, and you'll see this throughout the talk, is that these transnational criminal organizations, I'll call them TCOs for short, there's a very small number of them that have really been operating for decades and moving the lion's share of these large shipments. And some of them have been operating for 20 years or more, and the poachers, who are very, very abundant and easily replaced, they are dependent on this long-term stability of these TCOs because that is who is always going to be there to buy their ivory. So poachers can come and go, but as long as those TCOs are there stable, then there will always be a market for them. And the same thing is true of the buyers of all these products in Asia. They depend knowing who these transnational criminals are in these countries. And because they've been operating for so long in these countries, they also have really strong connections to the right corrupt officials in these countries to do their dirty work. So it's really quite a challenge. And they have a large number of strategies they use to reduce the risk of getting caught. The first one that I already mentioned is concealing the large volumes of contraband in this burgeoning maritime trade. Another one that is very common is that the contraband poached in one country is almost always transmitted out of another country. So what they do is they are moving it piecemeal. You're moving large volumes, and middlemen are coming and they're buying small bits of ivory, and they're moving it up to where these big criminals are consolidating the ivory. When the shipment gets big enough, they move it out. But they export it always out of a neighboring country, because if you've got a big poaching hotspot, law enforcement is going to be watching those ports. So if you move it to a neighboring country, then that is much less suspect. That is a really important way to reduce risk. And it also allows them to shift back and forth between countries. So you may be exporting out of one country, law enforcement pressure gets too high, you can move it to another country. You can't really move where you're poaching from, because those have to be large areas that have lots of animals, and where poachers know the area very, very well. So because you can't just walk into a 20,000 square kilometer area and know where the elephants are. So those things tend to make these hotspots persistent, but the transnational criminal organizations are moving the ivory out of different countries and shifting with law enforcement pressure. And the other thing that these transnational criminal organizations capitalize on is what we call linkage blindness. And that's the inability of law enforcement to link crimes due to failure to share information and cooperate. This term came out of work on serial killers. Because if you imagine, if you're a serial killer and you're operating in multiple states, in the early days, people weren't looking at, was a parallel crime committed in any other state? And so they were getting away with this for so long. And it really made clear the importance of collaborating between states and for the transnational crime work between countries. So that is something that we have been working very hard to do is build tools that allow us to make these linkages for law enforcement so they can see the connectivity. And genetics has been an incredibly powerful tool for doing that, as you'll see. And what we do overall in SEPs with all of these different scientists is try to identify, develop, and apply these complementary scientific tools to undermine the numerous strategies these TCOs use to reduce risk. I'm going to focus mostly on our work on the elephant ivory trade, but you'll see towards the end of talk that we're working on a number of different environmental crimes now. What we really try to do is to use DNA to determine where are the major poaching hotspots across Africa. Are they poaching diffusely across the continent, or are they really concentrated? I already kind of gave that away, that they're more concentrated. And then also to determine what is the size and connectivity of these TCOs that are exporting these large shipments. And the first thing that we do, you imagine a shipment of ivory, we don't touch it unless it's at least a half a ton of ivory, because we really want to get those shipments that bear the signature of organized crime. A shipment of about half a ton of ivory is worth almost $1 million. So you're dealing with a criminal that could afford to lose $1 million on one shot. And we're looking at where are these big criminals that are moving these large volumes, where's it all coming from? Where's the ivory coming from? Some of these tusks or shipments may have as many as 2,000 tusks in it. So one of the first things that we had to do was to figure out how do you representatively sample these shipments so that you are sure that if you determine all the ivories coming from one place, that it wasn't a reflection of a bias in your sampling. So that was a very important thing, and we had to develop tools that law enforcement could easily understand and do themselves. And one of the first things that we do is we try to find the two tusks from the same elephant to put one aside. Now that's very important because when it's so expensive to do this work, so you want to reduce your costs, but also that limits how many tusks you can analyze anyway, so you don't want to waste a second tusk, of the same animal because it limits how much information you have. So we developed a very simple method by eventually looking at the morphology of these tusks and realizing that the circumference of the tusks at the base is very symmetrical in the two elephants. Even if it's got a long tusk and a short tusk, that circumference is very, very symmetrical. So the very first thing we do is we weigh every piece and we measure the circumference of the base, write it on the tusk, and then we lay them out from smallest to largest, as you see here, based on the circumference. And what that does is it increases the probability a tusk is next to its pair. And you may also see here, those tusks in the back are whole tusks, and the ones in the front are tusks that were cut into sections. So we keep those separate because we're trying to also eventually group them according to morphological features, and tusks that are whole were more likely to have been in the same place than were tusks that were cut in sections. The tusks that were cut in sections were more likely to be together. So that's an example of how we might group them. So once you have laid them out from smallest to largest, then we go and we try to find tusks of the same color that are nearby, because there's going to be lots of tusks in the 2,000 that have the same circumference. But if you've got an orange tusk next to a white tusk, well, that's clearly not a pair. So, but the color, the pair of the same color should be nearby. So you just walk along the line and then you move them over so you're next to the same color if it's there. And then the last thing that is most useful in identifying the pairs is what we call the gum line. That's where the elephant's tusk protrudes from the lip of the elephant. And you can see that here. So that's the gum line there. Even this one's cut in section have a gum line. And paired tusks are incredibly symmetrical in the length from the base of the tusk to where that gum line is. And once you've done that, the pairs just kind of fall out. And it's really wonderful when you're doing this with law enforcement because, these are all, we're working with African nationals. They're used to looking at tusks, but they're not used to pairing. And as soon as they get it, they become better than than I am, who been doing it for years and years, and their eye is just wonderful. And so now they can do it themselves for the next seizure. The next thing we do is we cut a very small piece of ivory out of the base of the tusk. So that is the last part of the tusk to grow. It's the richest in DNA. And when we looked at where the DNA was most concentrated in the tusk, we found that this small layer right here, I don't know if you can see, it's a light white compared to this area with cross section. Those cross sections are called Schrager lines, and that's how you tell an African elephant from a mammoth, for example, is the angle of those Schrager lines. But this top layer here is called the cementum layer. The bottom layer is the dentin layer, and the cementum layer is really what glues this tusk into the elephant, and it's just loaded with cells. Whereas the dentin layer still has some DNA in it, but it's got so much more minerals that it's much harder to get it out. So the first thing we do is once we take the square, as we bring it over to the physics lab, and where there is a colleague who is phenomenal at using a bandsaw. And I wish I would have brought a video of it, because you just watch and you're just like this, that he's going to cut his finger off. But he's remarkable at being able to remove that. We then stick it inside this, a polycarbonate tube that you can see here that has stainless steel plugs on the end and a magnet in it. We drop that tube with the cementum layer into the liquid nitrogen in that chamber, which freezes the ivory so it's brittle cold, about minus 240 degrees Celsius. So if you drop that on the ground, it would just shatter. And then you shift the magnetic field back and forth about 10 times per second, and that magnet is pulverizing the ivory against the stainless steel plugs. In a minute and a half, it comes out like baby powder. And then we stick it in a chemical for a couple of days to take the minerals out, remove the minerals, and then extract it like any other DNA. And once you've done that, we then take the gene, once we've done that and we genotype the ivory, we use microsatellite DNA. For those of you that aren't unfamiliar with microsatellite DNA, it's the same DNA that the FBI uses in their criminal database, CODIS it's called. Also Interpol uses that. And historically, it's been very important because it's repeating sequences. We use dinucleotides, which means it's repeated, two bases are repaired, like GC, 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 GC. And the importance of the microsatellite DNA is it's relatively neutral. It doesn't really code for proteins. And so that means, and it has a very high mutation rate. So what that means is you're accumulating mutations a lot, but when you get a mutation, it doesn't hurt you. So you retain them. And so it makes that DNA extremely useful for telling individuals apart, is because it retains a high amount of variation. And using 16 different genetic markers, microsatellite DNA gives us a lot of information to be able to not only identify the individual, but also to actually get the origin of the animals. And the way we get the origin, so we take the genotype and we compare that to a DNA reference map that we made from across Africa, mostly out of elephant dung. And why dung? Well, elephant poop weighs about 25 pounds. It's easy to see. And so we were able to create this map. I mean, not easily, it took 20 years, but we were able to get thousands of dung samples, each from separate family groups, to give us very, very good estimates of gene frequencies or allele frequencies for each population on all 16 of those markers. The green circles are where we have forest elephants, and the yellow circles are where we have savanna elephants. They have just been listed as separate species because of our data, showing that the elephants, the forest and savanna elephants, have been separated for about 5 million years, it's estimated, using a genetic clock. And so when you're assigning origin and you're comparing the genotypes to these known origin reference samples, it's very important that you first figure out, do I have a forest elephant or a savanna elephant? tusk here. And then if it's forest, you use the forest elephant allele frequencies to assign origin. If it's savanna, you use the savanna elephant allele frequencies. And we can take a DNA sample from anywhere in Africa, and in our assignment, we can get it to within 180 miles of where it came from. So that's pretty accurate when you figure that about 5 United States fit in Africa. Okay, and right now we have analyzed, I'm going to show you data from, we've analyzed over 70 large ivory seizures since 2002. And just to give you an idea, the mean weight of it is 2.3 metric tons, so 2,300 kilograms. It's a lot of ivory. It's a lot of ivory. It's a lot of animals. It's probably 2,300 elephants on average in that. So as we started doing more and more of these seizures, we found a remarkable thing, which is over the first 10 years of seizures, but just looking from the period from 2006 to 2015, which is really when poaching took off, we found that almost 100% of these large seizures were occurring in just 2 places in Africa. Now, poaching is going on everywhere, but where these big transnational criminal organizations are getting these big shipments is really concentrated in just 2 areas. 78% of the ivory was from savanna elephants, and it was an area centered on East Africa, especially going from northern Mozambique, and most especially concentrated in Tanzania, going into southern Kenya. And then 22% of it was from forest elephants in an area that's commonly known as the Tridom, because it's the intersection between Gabon, Republic of Congo, and Cameroon. But as I mentioned, the ivory here is not exported out of the country where it's poached. And you can see that here. The majority of savanna ivory poached in Tanzania, southern and northern Mozambique is moved up to Mombasa, the seaport in Kenya, and exported out. And that was happening from 2009 all the way up to about almost 2013. But then there was so much law enforcement pressure that they shifted and they moved it to Entebbe, Uganda. But that's landlocked, so they have to transit it out of Kenya. But we were able to just show how this shifted, but yet how the connections between these operations were maintained even though they moved to a different country. And you'll see that in a bit. My phone's ringing, but it's just, I have hearing aids, so it's a bad thing. I should have shut the phone off, sorry. I'll ignore it. So the ivory from the forest elephants was being moved out of Togo, as well as Cote d'Ivoire, and most recently, Nigeria. Nigeria is really the mecca of this. Now, I'm just going to shut my phone off so that doesn't happen again. Forgive me. Okay. So, ivory's poached in these 2 hot spots, but moved out of a different country all the way up to 2015. Then in 2016, we saw a new hotspot emerge down here in the southern part of Africa. This is Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Namibia. And this whole intersection here is called the Kaza. It's the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. What's important about this area is there's 400,000 elephants in Africa. 230,000 are there. So you can imagine if you're looking for ivory to move, that's a great place to be taking elephants from. But why didn't they take it from there earlier? And part of the reason was that the president of Botswana, where the biggest number of elephants are, was very, very pro-conservation and very anti-legal ivory trade. And a new president came on board in 2016, and he started talking about selling elephant meat for dog food. because there's also, as you might imagine, a lot of human wildlife conflict, and he was trying to, support his voters, but you can see what happened. And all of this ivory is being moved out of either Luanda, Angola, or out of Kinshasa, DRC. Now, as I mentioned, if you're moving an average of 2 tons of ivory at a time, you don't get it all at once. It's moved piecemeal. I said that middlemen go and they buy the ivory from these poachers who are on foot, typically have as much ivory as they can carry, and they're moving it up to these places of export where it's consolidated until they accumulate enough ivory to make it worthwhile to do a big shipment, and they move it out. One of the things that we found, though, was when we were looking for the pairs of the 2 tusks in these shipments, was that over half of these seizures, we couldn't find a pair. And we thought, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if it ended up in a different shipment. But by now we had over 40 large ivory shipments in our lab, and we can look to see if there were pairs, if the 2 tusks from the elephants were in separate shipments. And if so, did they have a commonality between them? And we found lots of cases where that happened. And this is just an example of really one of our most compelling examples that we had of this happening. So this is one seizure. It was a 6-ton seizure that was shipped out of Togo, and it was seized in Malaysia in 2012. One of the things that you'll notice, which is really unique, we've only seen this one time, is that it's got ivory from both hotspots. Literally 4 tons of ivory from here and 2 tons of ivory from here. And somehow, even though it's across the opposite sides of the continent, it made it its way to Togo, where it was consolidated and shipped out. And there was a small amount of ivory from West Africa in there. We were very interested in who this guy was and how is the East and West connected there. And then there was a trafficker that Interpol and the US State Department were watching, because they believed that he was moving the ivory from this Tridom area to Togo and shipping it out. And so they were watching his warehouse, and then they started to see him moving tusks out of his warehouse. So they raided it. And when they raided it, we got the samples from them to genotype, and we found, lo and behold, that a tusk in his warehouse was an exact match to this seizure, which happened, this one was 8 months after this seizure was made. So what became clear was he was loading ivory from here as expected. He also received ivory from East Africa, combined them all together, and put some ivory in his warehouse into the shipment as well, as he kind of was accumulating the stuff to move out. But then very commonly when these guys get arrested, if you watch, shortly after you see a big shipment move out, because they've got other ivory that they've got stashed, and they want to get rid of the evidence. And Interpol was watching them closely, and sure enough, a few months later, 4 tons of ivory got seized at the port. And as you can see, all of the ivory pretty much is coming again from this Tridom area and a little bit from West Africa. But there's 2 odd tusks on the opposite, from the opposite side of Africa, and sure enough, they were exact matches to 2 tusks in this seizure. So he must have been loading this up, put some in here from his warehouse, saw 2 big tusks and took them out. Now he gets caught, and he goes to dump all of his ivory. He puts those back in, and we can see. So you can see how matching samples from the same, from the same elephant across shipments can really connect him to all 3 of these shipments. And that was a really powerful tool that we've been able to do. We published that work in Science Advances in 2018, and we literally pulled out the 3 biggest ivory traffickers in Africa by connecting seizure A to B to C to D, just like that. But the one thing when you're trying to get the 2 tusks from the same elephant, you don't have a high probability of having them both in your lab, because first of all, they're in separate seizures. You've got to convince, if 2 governments made the seizures, you got to convince both of them to give you the seizure. And then we only are sampling can only afford to sample about 30% of the tusks in each seizure. So that gives us at best a 9% chance that the 2 tusks are in our lab. So we then started to use a new tool called familial searching. It's a tool used in law enforcement. It's a bit controversial, where you may get DNA from a criminal from a crime scene and you match it to your DNA database, and you don't get a perfect match, but you get an almost perfect match. And chances are that's a brother or sister or a parent. And so that narrows the field that you can look for the perpetrator. And you may have heard of the Golden State Killer. That's how he was caught. It wasn't on a federal database. It wasn't 23andMe, but it was one like that they were able to find the evidence from. So we thought, well, why don't we do familial searching on our samples? So we looked at just parent offspring, tusks from parent offspring, and full siblings only, very, very close relatives that we felt we could reliably get with our 16 genetic markers. And we looked to see how often do we see these close relatives tusks in separate shipments. And what that did was it made so many more opportunities to get a match. And it also meant that we could tell how long these criminals were operating. If you're matching tusks from the same elephant, well, it was killed in one event. But if you're matching tusks from close relatives, they could be killed 15 years apart. And sometimes we see that. So you could see how long these criminals were operating for years and years and years. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Now I'm going to show you the beef of the talk and how we use this to bring down one of the biggest, probably the biggest transnational criminal organization operating in Africa. This was I work very closely with U.S. Homeland Security investigations, supporting their investigations. So we provide a lot of the data that they use to strengthen their investigations and prosecutions within countries. So we work with lots of law enforcement agencies and lots of countries, but they are our main collaborator in this case. And what this was it was a Vietnamese network that had a shell company in Cambodia where the ivory was being moved to and out. And what was really remarkable about this, they had cells, you'll see this all across Africa, where they had Vietnamese in these different areas that were moving ivory from these areas that had lots of elephants. But they all had the same modus operandi, which is that the ivory was moved in these hollowed out logs, hollowed out wood beams. They would hollow them out, they would cut the ivory into sections, and then they would embed it inside the logs in paraffin wax, and then they would put a board on top of it to cover it up. And this was the first seizure that alerted us to it. It was 1.5 tons of ivory in these hollow beams, but then we started to see many other seizures with the same modus operandi. Here's one from Vietnam, shipped out of Uganda. You can see this is in big wood beams, but you can see it in the paraffin cut into sections. Here's another one in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and here's one in Mombasa, Kenya, that was seized, but it moved out of Uganda. Again, that Uganda-Mombasa link there. So we had that same modus operandi, and now what I want to show you is how I'm realizing I have the wrong talk up here. I made a new version, but rather than switch it, I'll just go with it. I had more slides. For example, I was going to show you what those boards look like, which is pretty cool, but should I switch? Okay, I'll switch. I mean, we still have time, right? My apologies. Well, that wasn't too bad. Okay, so this is what they look like. These are the beams that have the ivory in it. And you can see they're painted blue at the end. And the reason they're painted blue is so you can't see the cut marks. But literally, they and we got these images from the cell phones of the traffickers, and it's unbelievable. This guy was taking actually took a video of it, and he ends up with the video with a selfie, which was pretty incredible. But so they put it in these hollowed out logs, and you really can't tell. They then push it to the back of the container, and then they load in these thinner boards that have cable on them, but they cut the cable. So now if you want to go search the container, you got to pull it out one board at a time. So very, very clever. And there were 3 containers all full of timber and 1.5 tons of ivory in there. So and then, as I mentioned, the same MO we see in modus operandi, we see in all these other seizures. In fact, there were 9 of them that Homeland Security got eyes on that had that. And then they went and they raided the shell company in Cambodia. And they didn't find any ivory in there, but you could see the big beams that they were using here. And they also found in the records of these shippers 9 other seizures that were moved that almost certainly also had ivory that got through. So we're talking about 16 to 18 different shipments that were moving. And these are the 9 that they got eyes on in yellow here. And you can see they all have hollowed beams. This is a line that shows you East Africa versus West Africa to show you, how they're really spread out. This is where they were seized. The way they're named is, this is the 3-letter ISO of the country. So Kenya, seized in December 2016, weighed 1.1 tons. Vietnam, January 2016, seized 2 tons. And came out of Mozambique again through Uganda, came out of Uganda. So you can see the breadth of this operation. They're really spread all out. Well, when this happened, by now we had all these other seizures, and only 2 of these seizures we actually got to genotype, this one and this one. Although this one is now, we just got this one last month and we're genotyping it now, along with another more recent one that seems to fit this. But basically, we only had these 2 that we had DNA from. And the first thing we looked at was that big transnational seizure I described to you before, where, remember, it had exact matches, which these black lines are indicating to these 2 other seizures. And the reason we were really interested in it, not only because it's transnational, but if you look at it, this 6 tons of ivory, they were all shipped in these big wooden boxes. And if you look, you've got wooden planks around it. These ones are just cut small. So it looks like, again, you're looking at a shipment full of timber. And sure enough, we saw familial matches. So a red line means it's familial matches. It's matches between parent offspring or siblings, and black lines is exact matches, tusked from the same elephant. And you can see that this seizure had familial matches to 2 of the this Vietnamese network shipments, 1 on each side of the continent. Now, an interesting thing about this guy, his name was Emil Mbuki. He got 1.5 years of jail time, which is really not very much. In fact, before we finished the investigation, he was already out. And he was swearing up and down that he was not the kingpin, that the kingpin was really a transnational criminal organization operating out of Nigeria, and he was just the pawn. And you'll see that that's probably true in a minute. And one of the first seizures that we see with a connection to Nigeria is one in 2013. Again, at this time when it was seized, we had no idea about this whole Vietnamese cell moving stuff in hollowed out logs, but this seizure was moved in hollowed out logs. You can see the ivory cut into sections in those beams. And sure enough, that also had familial matches back to this seizure as well as to this network seizure. Then we were very, very focused for a long time on getting the biggest traffickers in East Africa. So remember, they're moving 78% of all of the ivory. And there were 4 seizures here that were all connected, black lines, all have exact matches between them. So they're all clearly connected from the same criminal network. And they involved the biggest trafficker in Kenya and the biggest trafficker in Uganda. And this is part of how we show that they were really operating as though they were one. But the other thing that's really interesting about this is that, I think I'm pressing the button too much because it's running out of juice. Oh, there. Every one of these seizures have, you see Burundi ivory in it. So Burundi is a small country in Africa, it's right there. And they wanted to join CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It's the UN organization that decides whether species are endangered or not and how much trade can take place. Burundi wanted to join CITES in 1987, but they had almost 90 tons of ivory in their government stockpile and no elephants. So CITES said, you have to have a 0 quota, so you need to give that ivory over to Belgium, who will sell them to Japan and China, and before we will permit you to join CITES. So they did. But then civil war broke out in Burundi, and 2 years later, which was 1989, which is when the ivory ban actually was put into place by CITES, they had another 84 tons of ivory. And it's like, well, where did you get that from? And they said, well, we got it from these 3 traffickers, but it's all old ivory. And I'm going to return to this story a little later on in the talk, but when they came, they went and in order to allow Burundi to join, the CITES Secretariat sent a team over and they cataloged every single tusk. Whenever a government makes a seizure, they have to put a special catalog number on their tusk that has the 2-letter ISO of their country, the serial number of the tusk, the year of the tusk that was cataloged, and the weight of that tusk. So it's in indelible ink so that you always know. So all of these had that writing in it from 1989 seizure. And when they came to catalog the ivory, the people who did that said, well, the ivory doesn't smell. So we think it's old ivory, which is what they were claimed. Because in other words, if they got all that ivory in just 2 years, well, they should not be allowed to join CITES, but they bought it. And you're going to see later they shouldn't have. But in any event, so these were 2 really big networks. And by the way, the heads of both of these organizations were extradited to the US for prosecution. But interestingly, we had no idea that it was connected, except that it was connected to one of these CAM transit seizures. But we were really surprised when 2 also of these seizures connected back to this big multinational one, seizure, or the transnational seizure. Then we did another seizure, 7 tons of ivory on 4th of July in 2017 out of Nigeria. So the Nigeria connection to Togo is getting a little closer to, you can see they had familial matches to the big seizure that he got caught with, as well as to this shipment, and also to this network seizure. Then another huge seizure, 3.3 tons, also out of Nigeria, has exact matches, 2 exact matches to this network, as well as connections to all of them. And it just keeps going. Now, this was really interesting to us because this seizure here, this is from Angola, down here. And all these other seizures are coming out of Nigeria up here. But there was familial matches in this Angola seizure. And it was all the ivory coming out of the Kaza, as well as to another massive seizure. This was 9 tons of ivory, and it had 12 tons of pangolin scales in it. So I don't know if you know what a pangolin is. You'll see a picture of it in a minute, but essentially it's like an armadillo. Its hair is modified into scales, and the scales are used for medicinal trade. A lot of rheumatoid arthritis has been argued to be the biggest use of it, but it doesn't work at all. It's hair. But it's been claimed to cure everything from acne to hangover to impotence to cancer. So you can see that, now we're also have a connection to here, and these also were Vietnamese that were arrested in this in these shipments. And when we had this connection here, even though we're talking about a seizure that was shipped out of here to another seizure that is the Côte d'Ivoire seizure, that's Côte d'Ivoire there, very far apart, but you can see a connection. So that caused Homeland Security colleagues to look at financial connections between these networks. And one of the things that we drive in this trade now is trying to get, Homeland Security has realized, as have others, that trying to get these cases prosecuted is almost a fool's errand, because it so rarely happens, and when it does, they get weak sentences. If you really want to disrupt and dismantle this network, you look at their financial assets and you connect them all. If you show that they used legal currency in any, U.S. currency in any of the transactions to move this ivory, then the Homeland Security or Treasury can go into their accounts, even despite the Bank Secrecy Act. They don't need a warrant or anything, and they can track all the finances, even across other countries. They get to other countries because chances are they've made loans to those banks in other countries, so they say, you need to give us the data. And when they did that here, they also found that financial connection between this network and this big seizure of 9 tons of ivory and another seizure in Vietnam, also 9 tons. The same buyer paid for all 3 of these. So one of the things you can see is that by connecting these shipments together, it tells Homeland Security, or tells any law enforcement agency, these seizures are connected, whereas they thought the evidence they had from them were independent. Now they can combine it and really enhance their investigation. And lo and behold, this seizure here also connects back to this network here, as well as this shipment. And we had one less seizure that fit into this that also connects back. You can see from all this that Mbuki was probably right when he said that Nigeria was really behind this, because just look at all that, and all tightly connected to this network. But you can again see how rich this whole picture has become now. All of these have potential connections, and we can really start to see the investigation, how broad it was. We also see that this whole investigation, they thought they had everybody with all these seizures, but it started a lot earlier. It started almost 6 years, 5 to 6 years earlier than they had thought, and it continued to up to 2019, and in fact, it's still going on. So they disrupted many of the cells. People were put in jail. The shell company was closed down, and they thought that they had it, but it's still operating. But we're still building the case. Or they're still building the case. Now, at this point, I want to make kind of broaden the theme here, because one of the things that we have found is that these transnational criminals are now starting to expand the number of species that they're moving. You're already seeing from this, the majority of these shipments not only had ivory in it, but it also had timber in it, and about 80% of that timber or more was also illegally harvested. But all of these seizures with orange boxes on it had pangolin scales in it as well. And as I mentioned, pangolins are the most poached animal in the world right now, and 25% of all pangolin seizures are commingled with ivory. They're moved in the same shipment. Now, why would they do that? They do that because the ivory traffickers have been moving large volumes of contraband for years and years and years. They've got the whole network. They know who to go to. They know who to pay off. They know where to buy the containers from. They know what shipping company is going to move for them. They know how to manipulate the documents. So if you want to move large amounts of contraband now, like pangolins, you go to those guys. And one of our worries is that is going to rapidly escalate the demise of these pangolins because they have a way of getting it out fast. So trying to do the same kind of analyses that we do for ivory, we are now building in our center the capacity to do the same thing on pangolins and on timber, so that if you've got a seizure with all of these different species, you're getting so much evidence of how they're operating. And I'll just tell you, we've only done 2 big seizures that had ivory and pangolins in it. This one I mentioned had 9 tons of ivory, 12 tons of pangolins. This had 2 tons of ivory and 8 tons of pangolin scales. And in both of those cases, the ivory came from a totally different part of Africa than the pangolin scales. Here, all the ivory came from the Kaza and all the pangolins came from here. In this one, all the ivory came from the eastern border of Cameroon and all the pangolins came from here, from West Africa. So these guys are pulling stuff out of separate parts of Africa, really expanding their reach. And now if you're over there getting one species, then you can go and get the other. So it's just kind of like stepping stones. So really being able to understand how these networks are operating is key. And we're always trying to improve our precision. And so now I want to move a little bit away from DNA, because while DNA is great, it's not perfect. And you know, one of the things that we're doing now, we're moving from microsats to SNPs, because there's, you know, SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms, and there's millions of them that you can potentially harvest with the capture variability. But while we are working towards that, we also started to look at whether or not other technologies could be available that independently show provenance, independent of DNA. And one good example is isotopes, and especially the isotope strontium. Strontium is coming from the geological layer, and things that are growing in one area get a strontium signal that may be different from another area. And as I mentioned, we can get a sample to within 180 miles of where it originated. If you overlay that 180-mile area with a strontium map, we can get it to the park. So complementary tools. So now we're working with Eric Steig, who's the chair of ESS, who has a big ISO lab, and we're developing this technology with him. We also are collaborating with Turi Serling at University of Utah, who's the grandfather of this work, to refine this technology. We also use carbon-14 to date the ivory. You remember the Burundi seizure stockpiles I spent so much time telling you about, and that they said it was all old ivory. Well, we used carbon-14 to date them. Carbon-14 uses the degradation of, you know, it's what we call a bomb curve. Is up till the between the 1950 something and 1964, there were so many nuclear blasts from testing, you know, bombs, that any organism that was alive then has that carbon-14 signal in your bones, and it's got a period of decay, and you can look at where you are on that decay curve and figure out when the animal was killed. Especially for the tusk, remember, we're getting the sample from the base, so it's the last part to grow, so that tells us pretty close to when it died. If we got it from the tip, it wouldn't work, because it would be reflecting much you know, earlier in its life. But we have accuracy to within 6 months. And what we were able to show was that Burundi ivory in the last stockpile was pretty much all killed within 2 years of 1989. So it was all new ivory that Burundi had in that stockpile. Whereas when we assessed all the other tusks in our database, in almost every case, the animal was killed within 2 years of when its ivory was seized. So again, this becomes really important for a couple of reasons. So one thing is that so many countries now have massive stockpiles of ivory. Like Tanzania has almost 200 tons of ivory right now. And so if you want to make money, you can kind of sneak it out bit by bit as someone is doing in Burundi. But how do you tell? Well, that technology will help you know that. The other thing that is really important is that more and more you're getting animals that are like, you get a big seizure of live pangolins. And what these countries do when they seize it is they let it go in their country, but it didn't come from their country. So you're now doing the genotyping to figure out where did the ivory, you know, where did the pangolin come from? And what you see is where it originated, you know, its historical range, but you don't see, it might have really been poached in an entirely different country. Well, in that case, the isotopes and the DNA won't match. So it gives us a way, by bringing in these other tools, we can start to eliminate those. And right now, there's not a lot of cases where that is happening, but it's happening more and more. My graduate student is about to leave for Zimbabwe to do her dissertation, where they're translocating 400 elephants across from the eastern part of Zimbabwe to the western part. So again, you know, it's really important to add these kinds of instruments or technologies to be able to not only enhance the precision of it, but you also can use one to help validate the other. And so that's something that our center is working very hard to do. We also, for timber, have been using similar kinds of technology. DNA in timber is very, very useful too, especially because trees don't move. The only challenge is that most of the DNA, like in the tusk, was concentrated in the cementum layer, and the DNA, it's in the tissue just below the bark. So when it's cut into boards, it's a lot harder to get the DNA out of that. So we use isotopes, we use a chemical, a machine called a DART. It's a mass spec machine, direct analysis, real time, that ionizes the sample so you can get a chemical signature that is also very precise. But combining the technologies is very, very important. For example, some of the error in this DART machine, it turned out, is because people go to these really fantastic museums like Kew Gardens, Missouri Botanical Gardens, and it turns out that 30% of their samples, their voucher samples, were mislabeled because they thought it was something that it wasn't. They made a mistake at the time. They didn't have DNA. And so now you're building this reference map with the sample that you trust, saying, oh, you know, it's this species, but it's really another species. So again, you can see how the DNA allows you to make sure you're using the right samples here. We also have one of the members of our center, two of them, John Hermanson and Suzanne Pyre, developed a tool called Arbor Harbor. And what this does is it utilizes the same data that custom uses, and it looks at when a container is coming in, it looks to see if there's any of them that are containing suspicious timber that might mean it's illegal. For example, they're saying that it's got this species of timber coming from this country, but that species doesn't grow in that country. This guy used to move peanuts, and all of a sudden he's moving wood. You know, any number of characteristics. So it's a machine learning program that is able to look through, you know, hundreds of thousands of records to be able to identify these shipments. So now you can stop it and you get what we call probable cause. Okay, so they can do a more thorough investigation. And then he also, John Hermanson in our center, also developed this machine called the Xylotron, which is fantastic. What it does is it takes a picture of the edge of the board and it looks at the vesicle patterns in the board. And it's got, again, machine learning that compares it to about 150,000 different images, and it can get you the species in 5 seconds. So now you've got, stop the container quickly, verify it. And we also have people working on rapid DNA tests so that now we have good, solid reason to hold the container to do much more elaborate analyses. So all this kind of stuff is really important to build. And then the last thing that tool that we've developed, in 1997, my lab started one of the first wildlife detection dog programs. They were originally trying to find poop. And you say, why? Well, that's how we created our reference map. There's just so much information in them. It's very accessible. And as we got more and more into looking at wildlife crime, we really wanted to apply this technology to these shipping containers. Remember, there's 2.7 million containers moving around the world every day. Customs can only inspect 2%. Well, which 2% do you inspect? And dogs searching these containers is very, very slow. And we then made this tool that it's called a RAS, a remote air sampling device. And this fits right over the external vents on all shipping containers that are not refrigerated, have a vent here. Refrigerated ones have a vent, but it's in a different place. And you suck the air out of that, and it's captured in a little pad that you see here, that white, in this clip that's like a potato chip bag clip, and it fits right in there. You draw the air for about 15 seconds, and it's a cotton makeup pad that we found has excellent odor capture abilities, which means you can get it anywhere in the world. I can walk into a grocery store in Dar es Salaam and get him for less than a dime. And so if you want something that's cheap, that's going to, be sustainable, this is a great way. It holds the odor, but it doesn't hold it for that long, which is really important if you want dogs to detect it. And so in another building is our dogs, detection dogs trained on different types of contraband. You pull out that clip, insert it into the container that you're showing it to, and if the dog, if it's got the contraband that he's been trained on, he'll sit or she'll sit. And what's really important about that is right now, when customs wants to inspect a container, they have to move it offline because they x-ray it. And that costs time. And a lot of these shipments depend on being delivered at the right time. If not, the consumer loses money, or the shipper loses money. And so it creates a tremendous amount of tension amongst law enforcement and it's not the consumers, it's the buyers. I can't think of the term right now, but you get what I'm saying. And this technology, we can search these containers without even opening the door, breaking the seals. You can do it while the containers are still stacked. So you, again, increase the certainty of what you have. And the other thing is that this is a really important tool for what we call controlled deliveries. So controlled deliveries, I'm almost done, honestly. Controlled deliveries are essentially when you find a container that has contraband in it, and instead of seizing it, you allow it to go to the buyer. And then you nab them then. But the problem is with controlled deliveries is there's so many corrupt people working at many of these ports. As soon as you open the doors, the guys who own the container are informed. But here, the dogs are in another room, completely blind to the public. So in conclusion, the growth in the shipping industry since 2009 has really added numerous challenges to investigations of organized transnational environmental crimes. And our Center for Environmental Forensic Science has been developing these complementary tools to rapidly establish probable cause, like Arbor Harbor, the Xylitron, the RAS, and rapid DNA tests. We are able to determine provenance and poaching hotspots with DNA isotopes, and now with DART, and sample matching with DNA to connect these criminal organizations to multiple shipments and to each other, and carbon-14 to be able to detect resmuggled ivory, and machine learning we're using in collaboration with the e-science program here at the UW to develop ways of combining these different domains. And this is all really important because it demonstrates the importance of targeting these transnational criminal organizations for the totality of their crimes. And right now, what tends to happen here and really everywhere is you get a seizure, and the tendency is to just take it to prosecution quickly, ignoring the bigger connections. But what we've been showing is that there's a small number of these guys driving this trade, and if you keep it separate, you're missing the big picture. And this allows us to really show that and to try to get prosecution to change their focus. To the investigators and the prosecution, that enriches both the investigation and the prosecution. And this is a really great tool of doing that. And when you try to get countries to collaborate, and we're able to show them this kind of connectivity and why it's so important that this country and that country work together, whereas they never would consider it. This does it. So that's all. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go that long, but I have the gift of gab here.
And if there's any questions that people would like to ask, you have a little time.
Yeah. Thank you. So that's the challenge. You're right. But it's the challenge of all criminals. I mean, criminals are clever. And what you need to do is continue these investigations and try to stay one step ahead of them. You know, none of these criminals knew that we were doing what we were doing. And by the time we now had made all these connections, you know, we were very successful. And the thing is that they could stop moving the ivory to another country, but they can't really do that. So I don't know if I'm being clear, but you know, you figuring out how all the different ways that they're reducing risk, and then you try to develop a technology that addresses it. One of the things that's really important with this trade right now is that most of the ivory in these big seizures are whole uncarved tusks. We call it unworked tusks. And all of these countries have been passing laws all over the world that ban ivory trade. But yet the trade is continuing. And when you look at the number of ivory markets that are open and the tonnage, you know, there's 20 tons of ivory moved every year, and that's probably 5% of what's actually, there's 20 tons seized every year. That's probably 5% of what's smuggled. So 400 tons a year. That's so much more ivory than it's ending up in any of these markets. And what's happening now, we're pretty confident, is that these entrepreneurs are buying, or investors are buying up all the ivory and they're stockpiling it, hoping the elephant's going to go extinct and it'll be legal to sell ivory and then they'll have it all. So just, you know, when you start understanding the dynamics of this, you're able to pull these strategies together. But yeah, it's an ongoing battle, but, you know, murderers that are serial killers develop new ways of getting around the system. Everybody always is, but you have to keep on top of it. You would have to have an awful lot of it. Pardon? Yeah, you know, so people have done it actually at the UW with rhino horn. They took rhino cells and you know, I don't know the technology that well, but the stem cell type of approach, and made the rhino cells and used 3D printing to make rhino horns. And now, if you want to make enough to move the market, it's going to take a while. But the problem is that law enforcement went nuts over this. They said, how are we going to tell legal from illegal rhino horn now? You've essentially completely destroyed our ability to do this. With elephants, you're talking about lots of ivory here, and people will not buy. They're unlikely to buy the synthetic ivory. So there's been attempts to do it. There's a nut that I can't remember the name of the species that Conservation International was trying to market that you could be used for fake ivory. Another one that actually our center is working on now is giant clams have been now being more and more used as a substitute for ivory, and it's wiping them out. So, you know, it's just, you can't win. So what you got to do is you got to stay on top of the trade And tough answer. Tough question. Yeah.
So,
Anyone else?
yeah, any last questions?
Yeah. No. But we will. Nigeria is a really hard country to work in. But we have most recently got their customs to give us all of their recent seizures. All of these ones that you saw here, they were all seized outside of Nigeria. But Nigeria now has all of them inside. So they've got lots of good data that connects that seizure to the potential person. So it's an ongoing battle. But once you have all that information, the financial crime investigations is really what's going to get you to the bank records of the key people. And it's baby steps now. It's taken a while to get law enforcement to really rely on this technology. There's some that have bought it lock, stock, and barrel, but most people don't really care about wildlife crime. They care about counterfeiting and murder and terrorism and other things that are also important, of course, but these are kind of low priority areas. But now they're starting to realize that actually, for example, the human trafficking is completely interlinked with this. Those two traffickers that I said got extradited to the US, they were extradited not only for moving ivory, but for moving heroin and meth to the United States. So people are starting to realize that this is a bigger deal, and with time, hopefully, we will have the resources needed to get these guys. Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned that the ivory trade in the past, like 2005, 2005, there was. So what is taking place? What is
the big thing from 2009 was when the shipping industry really took off. And you can see that most of the big transnational crimes, not just environmental crimes, but anything moving in large volumes, really tracked the growth in the shipping industry. So that is our hypothesis for that. So.
All right, well, let's thank Dr. Walker one more time.
Thank you.